Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of the Revolution 250 podcast. Revolution 250 is an organization that celebrates the events leading up to the American Revolution and more. And we're kind of doing and more today. My co host is Bob Allison, and our guest is Valerie Foxx, who, among many other things, portrays poet Phillis Wheatley in a one woman performance. Now, usually Bob goes first. Today I'm going to go first. You, Valerie, are an entrepreneur, an actress, poet, writer, motivational speaker, and author. Now, which of these came first and is the thing from which the others sprung?
Yeah, the poet and the actress, they actually came first. So I've been doing that for quite a while. Family-owned business. We produce and write. My mother's the writer and director, so I get the honor of playing all these crazy characters that she imagines.
So you come to this by way of your family.
Yes,
Oh, that's pretty fortunate. Okay, Bob, go ahead.
So Butterfly Productions is the name of your company?
yes, it is. ButterflyFoxx Productions.
Very good. And how did you get to Phillis Wheatley? She has such a great story, which you tell. Could you tell us a little bit about her story and your story?
Well, Phillis Wheatley, I read about her in school, and that was someone that my mother had wanted me to play, and I just really just read her poetry. But then when I met you, Bob, about 5 years ago, you actually asked me if I would do a reading, a few minutes of Phillis Wheatley's poem, and talk a little bit about her. And from that introduction, it just created a seed. As I did more research about her, I wanted to do more than just read a poem or about her for a few minutes. And so that's how Phillis Wheatley actually evolved.
And so you begin your show really with Phyllis as a young girl arriving in Boston, and what a strange place it was.
Yes.
Can you tell us? I don't want to ask you just to do the show, but I'm wondering, telling her story and using her words, you do it in a very powerful way.
Yes, I start with actually her being, she's 7 or 8 years old and she's living in Senegal, Gambia, West Africa area when she is kidnapped by these evil men, and they were all carrying guns and whips and chains. And she's, along with other African men, women, and children, she's transported on a slave ship, traveling from West Africa over the Atlantic Ocean to America, which is thousands of miles. And the things that she witnessed as a young girl, it's a terrifying experience for an adult. And you can imagine being that young and having to witness all of that and not truly understand what's happening. A major separation from your family, everything familiar that you know, and then suddenly you're looking at people who look like you, but they're being held captured by these people who are terrifying to you. So the journey, Phyllis witnessed a lot of men and jumping overboard because they did not want to be slaves. So it was such a tragedy that happened to the people. But the miracle of the Phyllis's story is that she arrived safely in America. And in fact, on July 11th, 1761, she was standing on a slave ship called Phyllis, which she's later named as, and she was being there on display for sale, like you would sell a piece of personal property, along with the other people who had been enslaved. So it was a day that was promoted amongst people in newspaper ads, just like we would go shopping, for something, and you'd have your circulars in the paper. And so she stood there, young, trembling, scared, frail, um, and fortunately, the right family, I say the right family, and you'll see why later as I tell you more about her story, Susanna and John Wheatley, they were merchants, and they actually purchased her she was originally supposed to help um, Susanna with chores in the house, and because she needed help. Susanna had been sickly and she wanted someone to help her. So that day, when Phyllis arrived in America, it was a new surrounding. She had been snatched away from everything she knew. And it was interesting for her because as she traveled in the carriage around the city to go to the go to the Wheatley home, which was on King and Mackerel Street, I believe it was. And so she's looking around. I mean, these are people that are strange to her. She's in a strange land. She doesn't know anyone. But she finally arrives at the home, and that's where her story begins.
Wow. So you can't tell her whole story in your show. Well, I suppose you can. You have to make choices, like any actor. And what have you chosen as moments that you do portray?
Well, some of my most special highlights is the opportunity that she has to learn in the home because the Wheatleys have a set of twins, Mary and Nathaniel, and Mary is instrumental along with her mother, and she teaches Phyllis how to actually read. And they see that this spark in her and her desire to learn. And so as she starts reading and she gets hungry and she wants more education, so she studies Greek and Latin, the English literature. There's a library in the home which she has access to. And so she learns how to study on her own as well. So although no formal education in the school system, she's taught at home by Susanna and Mary, and also her desire to learn is what motivates her and to feed this hunger that she has to learn more.
I see what you're saying about, well, starting to see what you're saying about the right home. Bob, you're up.
So I'm really wondering, at what point does the family realize what a special talent, what a special person she is?
Well, it's amazing because less than 18 months after arriving, that's when I start to learn how to speak and read English fluently. And then one day I'm actually outside and I'm starting to paint a fence and just get involved in the artistic creative experience. And they start to see that I am an intelligent person, I guess, because they never had anything to measure me to in terms of I'm an African person coming to America. They didn't really think that I was like a human being because they had never really had witnessed that. And at the time, people thought that slaves were personal property, like a car or a house, something that you owned. And I actually had a personality. And at age 12, when I studied the Greek and Latin and English literature, I began to really increase my knowledge. I did I think the first part was my first poem that was published in the Newport Mercury News was a story about Missouri's Hussey and Coffin. They had come to the house and shared a story about their experience coming from, I believe it was Martha's Vineyard. And as they're telling their story, I'm getting creative images in my mind, and I captured their experience in word and shared it with Mrs. Wheatley. And she was, I guess, really, really impressed with that. And so she continued to mentor me and coach me. So there were so many amazing moments. When I was 17 years old, I wrote my first piece about George Whitefield, and it was published in London. So I was an international poet at that point because he was the chaplain to Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntington. And fortunately, I mean, I talk about mentoring and networking and coaching. I do that myself today, but to have that available in the 18th century, that is the connection, So Mrs. Wheatley and Selina Hastings networked and did business together. And so she, they often talked about being able to educate people less fortunate to actually see if, I mean, to say it's an experiment, I don't really want to put too much weight on that, but I would be the perfect example to see that I could be taught to learn and to read and to write, and that would change people's perception, which was not easy. That I could actually be educated, and I tell you, the education that I had was a lot more advanced than a lot of even people who had more money, people who were actually not African descendants, and I was just fortunate enough with the intelligence and God-given talents that I could actually tell stories and start to share those with the community that Mrs. Wheatley had. And she introduced me to her friends. She was like a proud mother, if you will. The more I impressed her, the more she talked about me. I guess I was just irresistible, and she had to share the gifts that I had. So I continued on writing, and I think one of the other things I wanted to highlight was that when my work had been published locally in newspapers and people had heard me and traveled to their homes, and they actually came to Mrs. Wheatley to see this person who was doing all these things. And so I had submitted a manuscript to get my works published, my poetry, 39 poems, and it was largely rejected in the area. But that didn't stop Susanna Wheatley. She decided to hook up with Selena Hastings and some other friends that she had, and she asked them, would they help publish my works? And so that's how I ended up getting my work published in London. And I look at I'd highlight the fact that it was two different worlds for me. I mean, if you could imagine me coming over on the first slave ship, coming here at 7 or 8 years old and going through those horrors that I mentioned at the very beginning. And now I'm actually on a ship going to London, where people on the ship were there to meet and greet me. They had heard that I was coming, that I was going to be traveling. And so I was, for the first time, I was treated like a human being in America. And there was a big thing. I mean, I actually wrote a poem called Farewell to America. I mean, it was this huge announcement that I was actually going to London. And so I had that excitement on the ship. And then when I arrived there and saw the people, they were open arms, and they were familiar with my work. And my experience in London was something that I will never forget, because they worked with me with the book cover and also getting my poems ready to be published as a book. And as I was meeting all these incredible people and experiencing the love from people's hearts, Susanna became ill, which cut my visit into London short. I didn't get to meet all the people they had lined up for me to meet, but I returned back to America to help her, which I felt like I needed to do that anyway. She had done so much for me. And shortly after I returned back home, unfortunately, Miss Wheatley passed away, but I felt good that I was there in those final moments of her life. And then following that, my book in 1773, there was the first announcement of the publication of my book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. And this is a copy of the book, the Phillis Wheatley book. And this design was created by Mr. Moorhead, and he designed it. I mean, they made all these arrangements for me when I was there. So you'll see Scorpio Moorhead. I actually put a poem in here about him because I wanted to pay tribute to him. He was a Black artist that helped with this book. So there were so many key people in the book that empowered me, inspired me, and motivated me to make this book happen at a time when there was, to me, it was almost like a miracle that had happened, and I was the person that was making that happen with the help of many other people.
So all was not peachy during this time, even though it's a better situation than previous, because I guess you, with your husband, were very, very poor, and your husband actually had to go to debtor's prison. Is that true?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, and you're right. Things took a downturn for me after Mrs. Wheatley passed because all my connections and everything with her, I had lost those. There was so much going on in the world. I did meet my husband and we married and we ran into some financial difficulties and he couldn't pay some of his debts off and he went to prison. And I mean, a lot of terrible things happened in my life. For the first time, I had to go and try to find work, and I had no experience working in people's homes because I had very little experience doing that in the Wheatley home. And so I was also a very sickly person. I had suffered with pneumonia. And so I had issues and couldn't maintain my health and think about Boston. I mean, it was cold and nobody really expected me to survive the winters here. In fact, they let me go for a little of nothing when they sold me because they figured, hey, she's not going to survive the winter. She's so fragile and so frail and she's really sickly. So you're right about that. I did run into a lot of things happen that my life went downhill. And I think that poverty, and I was actually largely forgotten after my experience with my connections with the Wheatley family.
Wow.
You also, your book also has, we want to get to your poetry in a bit, but it also has a testimonial from a number of the influential men in Boston who testified that you were who you said you were.
Yes, and you're right about that because in my book, no one believed that it was hard for them to believe that I would be intelligent enough to write these poems. And in fact, I had the trials of Phillis Wheatley, America's first Black poet, and her encounters with the founding fathers. Henry Louis Gates Jr. actually highlights that fact that I had to have a meeting, if you will, with these distinguished people who John Hancock was one of these people who and our founding fathers, they wanted to put me through an examination verbally and test my mental abilities to see if I had actually the original artist, original author for these poems, or, was people helping me? Was the Wheatley family there to coach and help me along and actually help me write these things? And as a result of me passing whatever test that they presented, they actually ended up, which was really a smart thing to do, was to create a notice to the public. So inside the book, there's a letter that says to the public, and it says that it has been repeatedly suggested to the publisher by persons who have seen the manuscript that numbers would be ready to suspect that they were not really the writings of Phillis. But then these people confirmed, there's an attestation that from the most respectable characters in Boston, that none might have the least ground for disputing their original. So it goes on to say that we whose names are underwritten do assure the world that the poems specified in the following page were written by Phillis, a young Negro girl who was but a few years since brought an uncultivated barbarian from Africa and has ever since been and now is under the disadvantage of serving as a slave in a family in this town. And they go on to say that I've been examined by some of the best judges and is thought qualified to write them. So this was the selling point to the book, and it helped to eliminate the doubt that I was not the intelligent person that actually wrote that. One of the things I'd like to tell you about, which is another highlight about Phillis, is that she was baptized at the age of 18 at the Old South Church in Back Bay. And that was also a church where Benjamin Franklin was baptized as well. And to take my Phillis Wheatley story full circle, is I had the pleasure in 2017 of actually being invited to that church on Phillis Wheatley Day and to actually tell her story to the children and their parents. And so I have a photo of me at that church talking and networking with the people that were there and sharing her story. And so it's just a moment that I didn't want to miss this opportunity sharing with you, because, we talk about the highs and lows of Phillis Wheatley. But for me, portraying Phillis Wheatley have had some most incredible moments as well.
So Phillis, or you as Phillis, met, if I am not mistaken, you actually were invited to meet with George Washington at his headquarters. Was that the Longfellow House headquarters?
Well, that's what they say. Yeah. I mean, I was invited to meet. Some people dispute that, but I stand by that. And, I actually wrote a piece, and I think that because of the person that he was, that people didn't want to make the connection that I would actually have the honor of meeting such an important person.
Really?
No.
So that's interesting. They didn't want to believe that. Are there any other cool, or I should say, any other founding fathers, cool founding fathers or mothers that you met? You mentioned John Hancock.
Yeah, Thomas Hutchinson. This was during my that 18 people in that meeting. Then so once they realized I was the author of everything, I totally had their support. So I think just by meeting those gentlemen, that it created a positive relationship between myself and them. I met a lot of different clergymen and people that were prestigious in the community.
Wow.
And
A
to
lot of
think
your
that,
no, go on, Valerie. Go on,
I was
Valerie.
saying, and outside of the fact of meeting Selena Hastings and in London, and just the people there, I thought those were really things that were special moments in Phyllis's life. And sometimes it's hard for me to separate Valerie Foxx from Phillis Wheatley, because I'm empowered by her and inspired by her, and I become Phillis Wheatley. So when I'm in this mode.
No, Valerie Foxx, first encountered Phyllis when you were young, reading about her, because she had an extraordinary life, and now you're sharing that. I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about what kind of a reaction you get from young people, school children, when you present as Phillis Wheatley?
That's a great question, Bob. Thank you. Yeah, so for the kids, the children of all different ages, I mean, they're intrigued by the story. Of course, they've heard about Phillis Wheatley, a majority of them, but making her history come to life is a different experience for them. So when I'm looking out at the audience and I'm sharing her story, I actually have a conversation with the kids at first and try to connect them to the story. I want to know how many of them are 7 or 8 years old. I want to know how many of them are actually have twins or know someone in the family. So a lot of the facts that are part of Phillis Wheatley's story, I try to engage the kids. And then after I share her story with them, I open it up for questions. And I remember some of the questions that I am asked is, did Phillis Wheatley ever go home to her parents? Then they want to know, well, what was Phillis Wheatley's name before she came to America? They wanted to know if she had any sisters and brothers. And so these are things, because, the traumatic experience of Phyllis, these are things that she did not remember. She only had one memory, and her memory was of her mother, doing a worship. She was a sun worshiper. And so she would hold this calabash bowl and hold it up every day. And with it had some water in it, and she would pour it down. It was like a libation. And so that was the only memory that I actually had of her. And of course, her dressed in her attire every day. So when I would share with the kids that I really didn't know, I could see them having this look, like feeling sorry that I didn't know who my parents were, and the fact that I never saw them again. So I think to draw the kids in and get their feedback was important for me. And so it made me think more of how to adapt the story to the different age groups. For instance, in Boston Public Schools when we get to perform for grades K through 12. I mean, so you have to present the story in a different way that you would for the elementary levels, middle school, and high school. And I think one of the other experiences that I had is, it's difficult to reach and connect to see how you're doing with teenagers. And so as I'm telling her story with the teenage group, we all get together, and I'm not sure if they're picking up or, understanding everything that I'm saying. But at the end of me telling Phillis Wheatley's story, they all come over to me and they thank me for the story. And then they want me to get into this picture with them and take pictures with them and their friends. So I think those are the types of moments that let me know that, yes, this message and her story can reach audiences of all ages.
It's amazing. I remember we have pictures of you with these young people at Dorchester Heights as they're just enthralled with this story you're sharing. I'm wondering, is there a poem you might like to share with us?
Yes, I will. It's one of the poems that actually that most people ask her to share, and it's called "On Being Brought from Africa to America." And this is one of my first poems, actually, and it goes like this: "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once our redemption neither sought nor knew. And some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Now remember, Christians, that Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train." That
Wow.
that poem was to send a message that in God's eyes, that no matter what you look like, what color you are, that if he can take you into his world. And that and one of the things that was about the Wheatley family is they were very, very religious.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned to read the Bible, and I often quoted the Bible as well to Phillis Wheatley. I'm sorry, Susanna Wheatley taught me how to read that Bible, and that became ingrained. And that was one of the reasons I got baptized at the Old South Church.
Yes. Your poetry really brings together the Bible with Greek mythology and Roman history. It's really extraordinary. So you can see why when you wrote this poem to George Washington, he is really stunned, because you're celebrating him, but he hadn't done anything yet. And he is somewhat embarrassed by it as you're offering him a throne, a crown. But you saw in Washington something, just as in your poem about Whitfield, you're saying he sees in America a mission for America. And it's a mission that includes people like Phillis Wheatley, who are very much part of this future.
So, Valerie, you have a bunch of fans here in the queue who I believe know you. Did you work at the South Postal Annex?
Yes, I recently retired.
Yeah. So first of all, is Wayne Greenside. He remembers you. Do you remember Wayne Greenside?
I do. Hi, Wayne.
And then there's Sean Stapleton. He says, "What's up?" Well, he says, "Didn't Val retire about a year ago?" Yes. And they say yes. And then, "Hey Val, miss you at the PO." So I guess you make friends and fans wherever you go.
Yes, I portray characters wherever I go. So everybody knows me from acting or, just being that person who's motivating, inspiring, encouraging people to follow their dreams. That's me.
So Phillis rose to great heights, but sadly died alone in a boarding house. She was young.
Yep.
How does that happen? And what is the lesson there?
Well, it's good thing that you asked that question, because she was 31 years old when she passed away. And when I share that with people, they're really shocked by that fact. And the fact that she's also buried in an unmarked grave and no one knows where that is, what it does for me is that it shows me that even though she was here for only 31 years, she made a huge impact and changed the way that people saw Africans as well as Black people. And so it goes to show you that it doesn't matter what age you are or how young you are, that when you have a gift and you choose to share it with the world, that it can inspire, motivate, and educate the masses of people, and in ways that you never ever know. And to me, Phillis Wheatley's world is just like anyone else's world. We all have our own celebrations, our own tragedies, and it's how we accept those and go on to live our life. And I let Phillis Wheatley's story inspire me to go on and continue to share the stories of my own relatives and their history. My parents were from the South, and they went through a lot, and they actually ended up migrating up north. And the stories that I share with my mom and family members are incredible. And so that's my connection. I want to continue telling the stories of fictional and non-fictional people so that I can create a base where people can learn about our history and the history of America. And even though slavery was an ugly, ugly time in America, you can't deny it. It was a part of our history. So we have to embrace it, acknowledge it, and move forward and find a way on how we can work together with each other to create a better world for the next generation.
Wow. Bob, why don't you, if you have a last word, go ahead.
I was just that was stunning, Valerie. Thank you for sharing that. And you've written a number of books about your own experience, your own family, and it's really which are inspiring to read as well. I'm thinking that Phillis Wheatley, also one of the ships that brought the tea to Boston, was carrying something even more important. That is the first edition of your poems, that published in 1773. So.
Yes, that was amazing. There was a lot going on in the world, and to think that my book was, actually the first time to actually see it in printed form. I mean, to go through the experience of writing it and all of that is one thing, but when you see your actual book published, I can't even. It's just such an amazing experience. And so, for Phillis Wheatley, that was one of the other best highlights of her story, was the book did get published. And you know that in 1786, finally, in the Americas, that they chose to publish my works here. So I hope they were inspired by having it done internationally in London, and that drove them to want to create my books. The sad part about to publish my books here, sad part about that is that Phillis was not able to witness it. But the great part about that is her story has been told, and there are so many people who continue to share her life story right now. And my dream is to someday that this will become a movie about her story. There's so much that we can't put in this broadcast about this magnificent and incredible genius, as they call her as well. And I'd like to see that happen one day.
Thank you. So would we. So thank you for keeping her story alive and telling it to so many, Valerie.
And doing it in such an engaging way. And thank you for, coming to our podcast and making it that much better. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate you both.
Maybe someday I'll get to meet you in person after this horrific disease is gone.
That would be fantastic. You never know where, life leads us. I'm hopeful.
All right, all. Thank you to you, Valerie, and thanks to Bob Allison, my co-host, and thanks to Jonathan Lane, the hard-working producer who puts this all together. We really, really appreciate all his work. And we will talk to you next week on the Revolution 250 podcast. Bye, all.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.